Good afternoon, and welcome to the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government School Board Governance panel series, where scholars will share insights from their scholarship on this topic that we care so much about. My name is Sadia Sundu, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government, housed here at the Harris School of Public Policy. At the Center for Effective Government, we are constantly working to bring practitioners and scholars together to strengthen democratic institutions and create a more responsive government. This panel series was created to further that mission by sharing current education scholarship as we think about what effective school board governance looks like. During this first panel discussion in our series, we will answer questions about representation of people and interest in school board governance. You'll have the opportunity today to hear our panelists speak about their work, and we'll also save not a few minutes, but say perhaps 20 minutes at the end of our discussion for questions submitted in advance of the webinar and from the audience. Please feel free to use our Zoom Q&A function if you have questions for our scholars. Before we get underway, I'd like to express our deep gratitude for the Harris School of Public Policy, the Chicago Community Trust, the Field Foundation, and the Democracy Fund for their continued support of the center's work. Finally, I'm thrilled to turn things over to our moderator, the director of the Center for Effective Government, Professor William Howell. In addition to his role as CEG's director, Will is a Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the University of Chicago, with appointments at the Harris School of Public Policy, the college, and the Political Science Department, where he serves as chair. He's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a co-host of Not Another Politics podcast. Will is an expert on separation of powers and American political institutions. He has written 8 books, including a co-edited volume titled Besieged: School Boards and the Future of Education Politics. His most recent book with Stanford professor Terry Moe is titled Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy, and was released this past July. Will, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadia. And thank you all for coming out and joining yet another Zoom meeting in your daily routine. We're really pleased to be able to gather and to talk about an important issue, and it's an important issue that's facing Chicago today as it continues to think about how the members of its current 7-board school board are to be selected and whose interests they represent. This is a topic that is salient for Chicago. There's a debate ongoing right now about it, but it's an issue that has been alive and well around the country for a good long time, and it raises lots of ancillary issues about in school board elections, in local politics, whose interests are represented, how power is expressed, what it means for different kinds of outcomes, both for teachers, for students. What we're going to be doing today and tomorrow is kind of breaking down the conversation into 2 stages. In the first stage today, we're going to focus on issues of representation. As Sadia mentioned, we want to think about in school board elections, what do we know about whose voices are heard, who comes out to vote, who comes out to run for office, who exercises influence. And then tomorrow we want to turn to issues of democratic accountability and student outcomes. What does all this mean for the kind of learning that does and doesn't happen in schools as a function of what kinds of governance system that we have in place? There's obviously going to be some overlap between those 2 spaces, but as best we can, we're going to try to focus again today on issues of representation. And we have just a terrific group of folk to help us think through these issues. These are all experts on local politics generally and on school boards in particular. And so let me introduce them, and I'm going to do it in alphabetical order, if I may. The first is Chris Berry, who is the William and Alicia Townsend Friedman Professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Chris is also the Academic Director of the Center for Municipal Finance and the Faculty Director of the Master of Science Program in Computational Analysis and Public Policy. And he's done really important research on metropolitan governance, the politics of public finance, and intergovernmental fiscal relations. We have next Rebecca Jacobsen, who is an associate professor at the Department of Educational Administration at Michigan State University. Rebecca does, she's got a background in politics and education, and she's done a lot of work on public opinion and its impact on education policy. She's thought a lot about how the public shapes the production of education policy around the country. And she's written about the politics of charter schools and the achievement gap, and her current work focuses intently on issues involving accountability. Vladimir Kogan is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Ohio State University, the Ohio State University. His research focuses on the intersection of politics and public policy in areas including education and social policy. He serves as the editorial board member of Urban Affairs Review and is affiliated with OSU's Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, the Education Governance and Accountability Project, and the Translational Data Analytics Institute. We have next Domingo Morel, who is an assistant professor at Rutgers University and an affiliate member of the Global Urban Studies and the Center on Law, Inequality, and Metropolitan Equity at Rutgers. His research program and teaching portfolio focus on the politics of race and ethnicity, urban politics, education politics, and public policy. And he's explored the ways that state policies help expand or diminish political inequality among historically marginalized populations. Finally, we have Jessica Trounstine, who is the UC Merced Foundation Board of Trustees Presidential Professor and Department Chair. I feel your pain, Jessica, of the Department of Political Science at UC Merced. She is written broadly on urban politics and thinking about issues involving process and representation. And she's particularly interested in how political institutions enhance or limit the ability of residents to achieve responsive government. Just a terrific group of folks. So let's kick things off and let's just get right after it if we may. And Vlad, if I could start with you. I think, look, when we think about involving the public in issues involving democratic governance, there's a kind of an instinctive sense that, well, elections necessarily expand the franchise and expand the kinds of voices that are to be heard, and therefore it's small d democratically enhancing. But I wonder if you might say just a bit about what do we actually know? I mean, that's the promise, that's the hope. What do we actually know about who participates in school board elections? Is it a cross-section of an electorate, or are there some segments of an electorate that are disproportionately represented in these politics?
Thanks. Well, thanks for the question. I guess let me just kind of set the stage with, I think, an important point that I think is worth making, which is like, what are public schools for, right? Why do we have public K-12 education? And I think it's important that, that I guess my perspective, and I hope it's not a controversial perspective, is that K-12 schools are there first and foremost to educate students, right? That's why they exist. And I say that because I think what's really interesting about educational governance and education politics is that often the things that people argue about really have nothing to do with that goal, right? The debates become about jobs, right? Whose jobs are going to be lost or whose jobs are going to be gained. It's about contracting. Are people getting their share of contracts from the district? It's about curriculum, and are people's vision about society or their views about science represented in the curriculum? And I think what's interesting is that for the most part, all those things have really only I think, distant connection to student outcomes or students themselves, and are really about adults and adult issues and like what adults want and what adults need. And so I say that because we have this interesting governance system, right? In the United States, we have over 13,000 school districts, each of which elects a school board. And why we have this system, I think, is kind of interesting. It's really this historical accident that 500 years ago, the Puritans decided that towns are going to be responsible for providing education, and so we just kind of borrowed that model. But it's an interesting system because kids don't vote, so we have this system designed to serve the interests of kids, but that primary stakeholder who's supposed to be served actually has zero say in any of these decisions. And so the question that becomes, well, who's actually having a say, and to what extent are their interests aligned with the interests of students? And so that's got to kind of come back to your question. One way to look at it is just to look at who's voting in these school board elections, right? All of our theories of democracy say that, in general, elected officials should represent the interests of those who are voting. And so we done some research on this where we got voter files, so we can identify voters who voted in school board elections. And then we have some consumer data. So we know something about these people. We know their race, we know their income, we know their household composition. And I think three really important things come out of this is most people who are electing school boards don't have kids, right? So the average typical school board election, and Illinois is actually one of our states, like they don't have kids, right? So most of the voters who are electing school boards, it's not that they don't have kids in school, they period just don't have kids right now, right? Maybe the kids are grown because they're old, maybe they don't have kids because they're young, maybe for a variety of reasons. So I think that's a really important point, right? That most of these people who were expecting to make decisions on behalf of kids don't actually have kids themselves. So the second, I think, big takeaway is often, not always, but often they look nothing like the kids who are being educated in public schools. And so the gap is really pronounced in terms of race. So, we look at a number of states, including Illinois, but most majority non-white school districts in terms of students have a majority white electorate, right? So not only do voters not have kids, but they really don't look like the kids. And I think that potentially introduces some pretty serious complications. So we know, for example, some evidence from school board members, if you ask them and you ask them in a way that they can answer truthfully, they say, yeah, voters don't really hold me accountable for closing racial achievement gaps. For some reason, it doesn't seem like voters really care that much. Well, maybe it's because like the voters are, don't look like the students and they don't have kids, so they don't really care about racial achievement gaps. And so I think the big takeaway is we have a lot of people voting. Sometimes we have fewer people voting, but regardless of kind of the size of the electorate, it really rarely looks like the students. And I think it introduces some frictions into the democratic process where we have a system designed to represent the interests of kids, but really not really set up to do that. And I think the best illustration of this, I'll conclude with this. I really encourage everyone who wants to kind of see this taken to its logical conclusion to listen to an episode of This American Life called The Not So Simple Majority. And it's about a school district in New York where there's majority non-white. And it has a school board that's elected by basically people that send all their kids to private schools. And they run this district primarily to like subsidize the private school kids. So give them transportation. They sold off all the public school buildings because they hired consultants to show them that enrollment was declining when it wasn't. And they really made a sweetheart deal to all the people running the private schools. So it was a district that had elections, but the electorate really had nothing in common with the students. And as a result, the school board really did not do anything to further the interest of the students that they were supposedly serving. So I think that's the big democratic dilemma that we face in this area. So thanks, Will.
That's what you've got us up and running. Okay, so already we see that the central stakeholder involved in the provision of education, kids, aren't going to obviously have a direct voice, and that those people who do their interests don't obviously align with kids. Domingo, if I could turn to you, could you say a bit about, this is something that you've written about, the interaction between different modes of governance and the representation of views of people who are historically marginalized. How are we to think about their ability, people who are Black and brown, to articulate their interests and have them be heard in positions of power when we think about education policy generally, but then also in school boards in particular?
Yeah, thank you, Will. So, a couple of things. So number one, I just want to emphasize what you mentioned, Will, about, this is a conversation obviously about Chicago. Chicago's going through through a debate about whether to transition from a mayoral appointed board to an elected board. So it's obviously very important to Chicago. But as you mentioned, this is a conversation that's happening across the country. And I think that it's important for us to note, I think the folks in Chicago know this already, but, where Chicago goes and so much of this, so goes the nation, right? And so Chicago is one of the most heavily studied districts in the country. And so what Chicago does is very influential in what happens in other places. So I just wanted to note that. And so then I want to go from there to kind of, I want to disagree a little bit with Vlad here about the premise that education is primarily about the children. And so not that I disagree with that, I just want to complicate it a little bit more, right? And so I think what we need to, and this goes into the question about race and what I'm mostly interested in my work, race and communities and schooling, and that, yes, schooling is about what happens with the children inside the schools, but we need to understand this, and particularly when we're talking about race and communities of color, particularly Black communities, about the history of communities educating their children, right? And so the problem with a narrow focus in thinking about education strictly about the children who are in the classroom is that it opens it up for policies that separate communities from their schools, because they're intended, on improving school for the children. And so what that means is, in the work that I do, is that because the schools may not be doing as well as they should be doing, that there are policies that emerge that separate communities from their schools. And so takeovers is one of those things, right? And so Chicago is critically important to our understanding of these types of policies, because what we know in Chicago is a heavily segregated city with a really deep, complicated history with race and their schools. And so what we saw in Chicago is that the Black community, which was marginalized for many years, worked its way to gain political power through the schools. And so in the 1980s, as they're gaining political power, they're gaining more and more seats on the school board. They get their first Black superintendent in 1981. They elect their first Black mayor, Harold Washington, in 1983. And it is precisely at this time that not only in Chicago, but across cities in this country, there's these policies that start to emerge and saying, look, school boards are the problem. We have a major issue with education, and the school boards are not being held accountable for the challenges that the schools are having. And so now we have to think about ways to get around that. And one of the ways that people were doing this, policies emerged, was in separating communities, separating their school boards from separating the communities from their schools and through the school boards, right? And so that's a history that I think that we need to understand, and that if we look at healthy communities with healthy school outcomes and healthy school environments, they're one and the same. Communities and schools are the same. And so as we engage further conversation, and Rebecca, Jessica, Chris have a lot more to say about this, I think that that's critically important for us to understand is the role of community in the schools, and to the extent, and to what extent are elected boards going to be representative of that. So in my view, and through my work, there is democracy can only, you can only have democracy by going through democracy, by doing democracy. And that's why elected boards are a critical part of this. But it is a lot more complicated than that, as Jessica, Chris, and Rebecca's research will show, and Vladimir's work as well. There are many things that we need to think about when we have elections, because it's not simply just transition to elected school board. There are a lot of complications with that. But I think I just wanted to highlight the important role that communities should play in this process.
Perfectly valuable. Thank you, Domingo. Okay, so we've got already a set of things in play, and it's going to get more complicated as we proceed. I want to hear from everybody, and then we can have some back and forth. Rebecca, if I could come to you, you've done a lot of work on the nationalization of education policy and education politics. And one thing, am I right to think that one thing that may happen when you make a transition from an appointed to an elected school board isn't just here within Chicago whose voices are going to be heard, either as individuals or as communities, Domingo rightly points your attention to, but also there's going to be through money and donations, and there are going to be efforts to affect what goes on within Chicago, because again, as Domingo points out, where goes Chicago, so go many other districts. There's going to be an effort to try to shape the electorate, shape the composition of the school board through outside influences. What do we know about what's going on? What's going on here?
Great, thanks so much. So we really got interested in this exact question of what is going on when we started seeing lots of news headlines. And by we, I mean my co-authors, Jeffrey Hennig at Teachers College and Sarah Reckhow in the Political Science Department at Michigan State. And we would see these headlines saying, thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars going to school board elections. And we kind of thought, what's going on? People sort of talked about school board elections as if they're antiquated, outdated, really talking about we need to look at national policies, national political actors to try to make big reform changes. And all of a sudden we were seeing that, some of these same actors that had been involved at the national level were now turning their attention to the local level. People like Laura and John Arnold, who have a foundation that is known for giving into education. Reed Hastings of Netflix, right? Somebody else who we often hear associated with school reform. Lorene Powell Jobs. They're donating money to school board elections across the country, and it seems sort of odd to us. So we started really a deep dive into 5 cities to try to understand this. And I guess a couple of things come out of that. The first is that it really does increase the cost of school board elections. In one case in particular in Los Angeles, one of the candidates in the prior election had raised $400,000, which is quite a bit of money to begin with. The following election cycle, as this outside money was continuing to sort of fuel these elections, he then had to raise $800,000. So it literally doubled between, from his first election to the next one. And so, these individuals with sometimes relatively small amounts of money can have a pretty big impact because school board elections are sometimes still held off cycle. They are sometimes pretty low budget affairs. We think about sitting around the kitchen table with friends and family that sort of help us organize and these sorts of things. And they've become really big budget affairs in some places. So this outside money was also changing the nature of the elections in a couple of ways. First is it was drawing more attention to the elections. And in some ways, that's a really good thing, because in some of the prior cycles, when outside money wasn't evident, we couldn't even find any local or national news coverage of these elections. So if we want people to be participating and voting, it's pretty hard to do that if you have no information about what's going on. So the increased attention, seems like a good thing, but unfortunately that attention often turned to money, right? So it became about money, how much money, who's getting it, who's not getting it, where's it coming from, and these sorts of things. And it also, what we saw in the news media was increasing sort of negativity and polarization. Outside money was prompting some of these candidates to really feel like they had to pick a side and pick a very hardline side. And so when they were sort of more sleepy affairs, they felt like they could be more make bargains with each other. They could compromise. But when you're having to attract tens of thousands of dollars, as one of our candidates said to us, most donors don't like the middle approach. They want people who are going to pound their fist for this or pound their fist for that. And so candidates were becoming very aware that they had to pay attention to the kinds of votes that they were taking, because it might impact their likelihood of being able to attract donors in the future. And so it was causing them to become sort of more polarized, especially around issues of choice in charter schools. That was really the divide that oftentimes candidates that we spoke with felt like they couldn't cross. It also did change not necessarily the racial composition, but the pools from which candidates were being drawn from. So teachers' unions supported candidates. About a quarter of them were had former teaching backgrounds. But about half of the reform-backed candidates had charter school backgrounds. So again, you see this sort of tension across the line of, are you a charter or are you a traditional public school, as if there's not a spectrum of a whole bunch of things in between. And then I think the last thing I'll share, though I could go on about this for quite a while, is that it really changed what got talked about. Like I said, money got talked about, but also it changed away from more traditional sort of local issues, right? Sometimes we think about, superintendent board relationships, community relationships being topics that the board is talking about, that's getting covered in the news. And really what we saw shift over time was that nationalized issues were becoming the focus of these elections. So things like tenure, things like accountability systems, things like teacher retention and holding teachers accountable. So it was less about local issues, and many of the candidates that had wanted to talk about other issues, things like adult education for immigrant families to try to help support their children, that just couldn't get on the radar screen, and they felt like that was really getting drowned out. So those are some of the sort of big things that we found from when outside money does become part, and it's not always, but when it does, it can activate some of these processes that do change the elections.
I did it. I spoke with the mute on, and therefore shift who's participating, what the agenda is, and then the nature of the discussions that follow, the extent to which they're polarized or not. So a lot is in play. Chris, if I could come to you. So one thing that is of real interest is not just whether or not to have an election, but when to have an election. And when we have it, if it's, on the same day as we're electing the mayor and the governor and the state senator, or if we're holding it on a random Tuesday in March, can have big implications for what the composition of an electorate is. This is something which is true, I imagine, not just with regard to school boards, but in lots of local races. Can you sort of get us oriented in thinking a little bit about issues involving electoral timing and what their implications are for the politics that follow?
Sure. Thanks, Will, and thanks everybody for the conversation. This has been great already. Just one context setting point I'd like to make before we start, because it's going to be important in my answer, but a lot of others, is as we ask these questions about, say, an elected school board, it's important to always ask, compared to what? Compared to what alternative way might we select these folks? And so when we want to think about something like, for instance, money, it's true when we have an independent elected school board, it's a separate election, there will be donations there. But again, it's not as though money doesn't get into education politics if we had an appointed school board. Those same interests may be donating to the mayor or to other interests that appoint and influence schools. So I do want us to always just have in the back of our mind this question, compared to what? Because if the alternative was, we could turn on a switch and just get some perfectly representative school board that was uninfluenced by any kind of nefarious interests, of course we'd all choose that. And then it would be an easy problem and we'd all be here advocating for that. But I want us to just always bear in mind, what are we comparing this to? And is whatever the problem is, representativeness, money, or what have you, is it different here? If so, why? So to your question on election timing, I think one of the things we know is that it is one of the single most important factors in determining the level of participation in local elections. And by the way, a lot of what I'm going to say, I know because of Jessica's work on this topic. But I would say, if you could pick only one variable to predict the level of turnout in a local election, that variable should be timing. In particular, is it held coincidentally with some more prominent state or federal election, or is it not? And when school board elections or other local elections are held sort of separately off cycle on their own day, as they often are, a turnout can be radically low. So we know just in Illinois, for example, where this happens, and we have other elected school boards, turnout on the order of 10% is not at all unusual, 10%. So there's that. But importantly, mayoral elections, at least here, are already held in off-cycle elections. And so what are we comparing? Well, we're comparing what is turnout in a mayoral election. If we're going to compare an appointed school board, who votes for mayor? How representative is that electorate? And then should we compare it to a school board? And is there a reason to think that the school board electorate would be any more or less representative than the mayoral electorate? Again, my guess is going to be, given that based on everything I've heard discussed so far, they'd probably be held on the same day. They will probably have equally unrepresentative electorates. Now, a lot of people are promoting the idea of an elected school board because of its supposed benefits for representativeness and democratic participation. A bigger and probably better reform would be to change the time of these elections, whether the mayoral election or the school board election, put them at a more popular and convenient time. That would do more than anything to increase the overall level of participation and the representativeness of the electorate. Related point in terms of this question of representativeness, we've talked so far a lot about sort of demographic notions of representativeness and whether the electorate kind of looks like the population or does it look like the student body. As Rebecca said, we also want to think about the representation of interests and interest groups. And so when you think about whether it's the advocates for charter schools, they're looking to get contracts, they have a financial stake in the education policy selected by the district. Also the unions, the teachers unions. I mean, we know that the teachers unions are the single biggest donors to state and local politics, period. And so the question is, if a school board election were held separately, and that was the only thing the school board did, you would expect the teachers union to be a much more dominant interest group in that single function election than you would in the mayoral election, where the teachers union is clearly important, but they're one of many important interest groups that the mayor has to balance, right? Because she does lots of things and there's lots of different groups competing for her attention. If you have a government that does only one thing, and that's education, is there going to be some other countervailing force that's competing with the teachers union? And just by the way, you may think increasing the influence of the teachers union is great. I'm not making a judgment as to whether this would be a good or a bad thing, but as a matter of fact, one of the things we should really predict is that the teachers union will be a much more influential voice in an independently elected school board than it is now. For good or for bad, that's a different question. And that's no accident that the teachers union is probably the biggest force behind this proposal.
Thank you, Chris. Jessica, so boy, you've written a bunch on electoral timing. You've also written on thinking about differences between at-large versus ward elections. So this is another feature. It's not just whether or not we have elections, it's how we structure them. And so Chris, playing off of the work that you've done and work that he's done to emphasize this importance of timing, can you say a bit too about what do we know, not necessarily on school boards, but city councils, for instance, what do we know about having at-large elections as opposed to district or ward-based elections, the implications for these, for what the composition is of an elected body?
So I'm going to answer your question, Will, in just a second, but I'm going to start by backing up a little bit, taking a cue from Vlad. So I just want to sort of frame a couple things here. The first thing to say is that if everybody agreed on what the outcomes should be, how we should structure our schools, what our curriculum should look like, how best to educate third graders to read, we wouldn't need politics, right? Part of what is hard here is that we have differences in values, we have variation in priorities, and we have scarce resources to allocate. So that sort of sets the stage for, there are always going to be political battles in the process of creating local government and in schools and school boards. My work has shown that you can have limited representation and marginalized voices, both in appointed systems and in elected systems. So I wrote a book, part of which features Chicago. It's called Political Monopolies in American Cities, where I look at this. I compare how do appointed systems compare to elected systems. And it turns out the devil's in the details. There is no single system that ultimately maximizes representation on, in any particular case. And by the details, I mean exactly what Chris and Vlad and Domingo and Rebecca have already talked about, which is when is the election being held? Who gets to make the appointment? Who gets to say no to the appointment? How does the budget get created? Who has veto power, right? There's numerous different ways in which we can structure our systems that affect how marginalized voices are brought to the table. And in my view, the best system is the system which maximizes the number of different kinds of views and the number of particularly marginalized voices who are at the table. But there are, so the question that you asked, Will, is how do we elect these people to the particular body that we're talking about? So in some systems, the whole city elects all of the representatives. That's called an at-large system. In other cities, a geographic segment of the community elects their representative. And that makes a big difference in who gets elected to the city council or to the school board along racial lines. So we know that district or ward elections are much more likely to elect people of color, particularly in very segregated cities. But we also know that at-large elections pay much more attention, the representatives pay much more attention to sort of the larger issues facing the community rather than the narrow geographic interests of the community that they're representing. But so one thing we want to think about here are the steps of the process. How do the candidates get recruited? How do voters get information about who the candidates are and what they say they're going to do? Who gets to vote in the process? And what do our rules say about how different voters are going to be brought to the table or not brought to the table? So the timing of elections really matters, but there are other things. How hard is it to register to vote? Do we have purging of the voter rolls? We can go back in history and find lots of examples, literacy tests and other things that restricted who participates in elections. And then finally, how do those actual seats get allocated? And so we might ask whether or not a particular geographic community has a designated representative on the school board or not, or is it the whole city? So all of these pieces of the voting process and the governance process and the details with which we design our institutions will ultimately matter a great deal in whether or not Chicago's community is broadly represented or not.
Could I stay with you, Jessica? You've just laid
Sure.
out, I mean, you've done a nice job of pulling together lots of factors that are going to matter a bunch, so that this kind of basic distinction between appointed versus elected, I mean, yes, on average, there may be differences, but there are huge differences within both spaces as a function of all these things that you've laid out. If we think about just with regards to elections, could you paint a picture of what a really undemocratic election might look like, unrepresentative, and then paint a picture of what sort of a set of rules and practices that would be broadly expansive and small d democratically enhancing, kind of so we have
Sure.
kind of pictures of
Yeah,
each.
so I'll give a couple of examples, sort of drawing on this structure of the stages of the voting process. So in terms of information, we need to have a system that maximizes the ability for voters to learn about what the government is doing and learn about what the candidates stand for. So a kind of system that limits information is one where there's a cruddy local newspaper or maybe no local newspaper. It's very difficult to find candidate statements. There's nothing mailed to the voters. You don't know when the election is being held. Just a little sidebar. I lived in New Jersey for a while in an area where they really didn't want me to participate in elections. And it was really hard to figure out even where to go and cast my ballot, right? When voters don't have information about the election and the electoral process, that is a very restricted, non-democratic type of system. Alternatively, when you mail voters information about the process, when you have a vigorous and robust local news organization that is reporting on what the candidates are saying and what they're promising and what they have done in office, that is a more democratic sort of system. In the second stage of the voting process, when we are deciding who votes or structuring a system to enhance or limit representation, we can place a lot of restrictions on who gets to participate. So we could purge voter rolls. We could make the registration office only open for certain hours of the day. We could hold elections on weird times and weird days. There are historical elections that were held on like the fourth Saturday in, July. And guess who shows up to those elections? Yeah, it's just the people who care the most about the outcome. And it's not broadly representative. A more broadly representative system is going to be one in which voters are encouraged to come to the polls. There are a lot of different kinds of institutional structures that get mobilization happening. People are able to register on site if they've forgotten to register in advance. Those kinds of systems make a voting system more democratically accessible. And finally, in the seats process, when we're figuring out sort of who gets to actually hold office, the most representative kind of systems that we see are a blend of a citywide view. There is some perspective on that board or that legislative body that can think about the city or the community as a whole, but then every neighborhood has a voice, every neighborhood has a say. That is a much more representative sort of structure than one in which only one neighborhood, and a lot of my research shows that when you have at-large elections, almost all of the representatives live in one particular part of town. And guess who gets all the parks and all the libraries and all the goodies and all the good stuff that comes from that board? It's that neighborhood. So again, we can think about this in there's so many details. Will, I could talk forever, but I'll be quick.
Okay, this is terrifically helpful. Thank you. So we have questions rolling in, which is terrific. So I'm going to start fielding them and putting them out, and I may direct them to one of you, dear panelists, but others feel free to jump in at any point. We have to kick things off. We have one from Sadie, who is a friend of the Center for Effective Government. She was a CLA member from 2019. Great to hear from you, Sadie. Knowing money on all sides plays such a big role. How can we work to ensure that parent voice is well represented on school boards? And could I go to you, Rebecca, on this one? I mean, when you see the expansion of money in politics, keeping in mind Chris's point, which is just because we go to elected school boards doesn't mean that suddenly, money's coming in anew, afresh for the only time. I mean, there's money no matter what. But how are we to think about the representation of parents' voices in particular, and how the extent to which they're displaced or not?
Sure. So I think one of the issues becomes to what extent are, even when local people are running for a local office, but their funding is coming from, say, an outsider, are they seen as truly sort of local and representative of the community, right? So I think we oftentimes think about descriptive representation, right? Is there sort of a match in race or ethnicity or gender? But I think that many of the people that we talk to recognized that, it really takes the local voters that are going to turn out and support you. And there's more to it than just having, the right last name or the same, sort of skin tone color that is going to make people feel like, who are voting, yeah, you're actually going to represent my interests. The other thing I would say about parents in particular is that sometimes school boards are actually very criticized for having too much parent voiced. So sometimes, you often have in, smaller communities, maybe not necessarily Chicago, but school boards where a few parents really do capture sort of the school board with their particular interests. And this can be true, especially at the school level. You see it sometimes in PTAs play out, where there's conflict between, in a diverse school where there may be some higher income parents and some lower income parents, some real sort of struggle back and forth between whose interests are going to be represented. Are we going to offer French immersion, or are we going to offer, after school tutoring support for kids, right? With these two very different pulls. So I think that parent representation is important, but I also think parent representation can be focused on my kid, rightfully, right? I love my kids too, and I want what I want for them. But so parents are not always the best representatives either. I wanted to piggyback on something that Jessica said too about, if we want to make this more democratic. And one of the things related to money that I think is important is the extent to which people can find out money is available. So certainly one of the things that we experience trying to explore local donations is a huge variation across place in terms of the accessibility of that kind of information. And so even on top of having a good local news source, you need to have money, you need to have information that makes this available readily and easily. In some cases, we actually had to send a graduate student to do hand photocopying because that's sort of the state of technology in local elections and disclosure information. The other thing that we were seeing was that some donors are getting really savvy about this. And so they hold off until they know that the money won't show up in their filing reports until after the election has happened, because that final election piece comes in. And so in some cities that we looked at, there was this huge push at the very end of just like, a dozen people were getting barraged by a dozen things. The mailbox was so-and-so's name on it. And so that's, another way that money can be very strategic in the timing and that it comes in. And that's something to think about.
Domingo, you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I just want to add to Rebecca's point about the parents, that it's important to think about the role that they play and sometimes the overrepresentative role that they play. But this is where community organizations are critically important as well. And Chicago has a rich tradition of community organizations organizing for school issues, like, let's say, the school closures, right, where Chicago was at the forefront of this nationally, and communities were responding to this. And so Sally Nyama, who's a political scientist at Northwestern, she's done really good work on this, showing how communities engage in Chicago with their schools and how that translates into broader politics as well. So, for instance, she shows how the lack of Black support for Rahm Emanuel led to his deciding not to run for office this time around, right? So there's this strong connection between communities, particularly Black communities, Latinx communities, their schools, and the broader politics in Chicago that I think we need to highlight, we need to think about as well.
We have a couple of questions playing off of what you've just laid out, Domingo. A couple questions that are are directing our attention specifically to non-citizens and the extent to which their interests are represented in education politics. How ought we to think about the possibilities for the interests of non-citizens gaining voice in, again, keeping in mind Chris's point, which is appointed, the current status quo is a mayoral appointed versus some notion of an elected school board, the extent to which their voices are likely to be heard. Vlad, do you want to take the first shot at this?
Yeah, I will do my best. I guess I think I will add to Chris's point and kind of in this context, which is I think it's important to think about the counterfactual, and I think the counterfactuals are not just appointed school board versus elected school board, right? Especially when we're thinking about empowering parents and we're thinking about empowering parents who may not have voting rights in the United States. There are other more dramatic reforms that like directly empower parents, and I would say New Orleans is a great example where you just allow parents to choose where the kids go to school, right? There is no geographically based attendance boundaries. And that is a system, right, that is really about like parents. Now that has limitations. I think we've seen that it turns out there's not that many good schools. And so even if you have the choice, it doesn't mean that you actually have the ability to send your kids to a good school. And there's other issues that come into play in terms of admission processes and school discipline. But I think if the goal is to empower parents, particularly parents that have that may have legal barriers to participate in democracy, I do think it's worth thinking about those other reforms that don't involve voting, right? That give parents opportunities to play an active role in the kids' education, even if they may not be able to participate. Because I think whether it's elected school boards or elected mayoral elections, those communities that can't vote are going to be just systematically overlooked.
Thank you. Chris.
Just one small point on this, which is worth thinking about specifically in the Chicago context, is we've long had these local school councils, and one of the things that distinguishes them is that non-citizens can hold those seats and vote in those elections. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what is it that would prevent that from being possible for an actual school board member, but apparently it isn't possible. So I think that is a kind of trade-off, that if the creation of an elected school board de facto is going to mean the diminution in the authority that resides in local school councils, is a trade-off we should really think about. And then again, how interests get represented is not always through voting, and it's pretty clear that even say Mayor Lightfoot is paying attention to undocumented people in Chicago. There's been a number of reforms that suggest she's giving attention to those communities, maybe not as much as some would like, maybe more than others would like, I don't know. But we should, again, just compare, is there a reason to think a local school board would result in more or less of this? I think there would be reasons to be concerned that their influence of undocumented folks might in fact go down under an elected school board, particularly one that is very geographically focused, so that people are kind of worried about their own local school rather than citywide issues. And there might be reasons to think that in fact the mayor would be more attentive to those constituents than an elected school board might be. Again, I don't think we have direct evidence on this, but I think it's not obvious that it goes in the direction of just more elections equals more representativeness of interests.
Jessica, I saw you nodding. Is this ringing a bell in other domains outside of education too?
Yes, exactly. So we have a lot of evidence that people who are barred from participating in the electoral process can sometimes get better representation through appointed officials, right? Sometimes the court system works in this way for people who are unable to participate in elections. But it's not always true, right? It's also possible to capture the voices of the appointers and the appointed, right? And so again, I want to just reiterate that it is possible to marginalize people in both appointed systems and elected systems. And there is creating an elected system out of an appointed system is not suddenly going to bring more voices to the table at all, right? It may bring some voices to the table and exclude others.
Can I add one more thing to that? I'm sorry. So I think here's where, again, like Chris, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that in our federalist system, right, we experiment and then we either learn or get challenged in the courts. And so I think that this if we are really interested in increasing the role of non-citizens, that we can think about creative ways to increase participation, and let's see where that takes us, right? So that's number one. Number two, that there is a way, because we know that families have mixed status, so that there are ways that we can increase the voice of the young people in households who are more likely to be citizens but are less likely to vote because of age. So try to increase the number of 18, 19, 20-year-olds from mixed status communities to households, increase their participation. That will increase the likelihood that the voices of non-citizens will be more represented in these places. And then third and finally is, again, the role of community organizations. They have always played an important role in representing communities that have been excluded. And so there's also a way for community organizations to increase their voice through this as well.
Terrific. So we have a question that is picking up on something that Vlad laid out at the very top, saying, is struck by the fact that students themselves are the most underrepresented, non-represented group in schooling. The kids are not going to be able to cast votes nor hold seats on an elected or appointed school board. How might we think about innovative ideas or approaches to better align the interests of elected school board members or appointed school board members with the core interests of the kids themselves? And since, Vlad, you are the one who underscored this as a troubling facet of any form of democratic governance, I wonder if you might get us started in thinking about what might create a greater level of alliance.
Gosh, I wish I had a good answer. I think there's trade-offs, and I don't think we really have much empirical evidence on this point in terms of alternative governance arrangements. I do think we have some evidence, again, kind of going back to the New Orleans model of really thinking about creating mechanisms, not just for the kids, but also for their parents to play a more active role. And I think that is probably the most promising thing that we've seen, right? In urban areas where you have the most dramatic skew in who's being elected versus where kids are being educated. I think we have seen, right, that charter schools have played a really important role. And again, in urban areas, charter schools tend to do significantly better. And I think they also tend to change the dynamics, right? Because they create some competitive pressures now. And so if you're not serving the kids well, then the parents will pull them out and send them to someplace like the Noble Academy in Chicago, which is a high-performing charter school. And so I think it's those kind of reforms that provide exit options, that provide some competitive pressures that are probably most effective at increasing how much attention is paid to the interests of kids, much more so than appointed versus elected school boards, at-large versus district elections, and all the kinds of stuff that we as political scientists tend to focus on. I think those are things that are probably of much smaller magnitude in terms of their effects for students and kind of their interests being represented.
Rebecca.
So I was just gonna add to that, there is some research specifically on school boards looking at, does the election of Black and brown school board members actually translate into substantive policy changes, right? And this is a really hard thing to get a handle on because there's so many intervening factors, but it pretty consistently, what limited their work does find that one of the most important things that happens is that you get more Black and brown administrators, who in turn is sort of this long causal chain. So hang with me for a minute, right? That more Black and brown administrators who then hire more Black and brown teachers, who then, have the opportunity to serve as role models to, work with those that maybe they're from the same community. So kids have better graduation rates, lower rates of suspensions and disciplinary actions, more gifted identification, lower special education identification, right? Sort of these intervening things. So not necessarily test score outcomes maybe, but that it does seem to be that we get more, not only representation on the board, but representation in our schools, which I think is really important too, because, we know that kids, especially Black boys, do seem to do better when they have other Black teachers, especially Black male teachers.
Terrific. And and tomorrow I want us to make sure that we pick this up as we focus intently on what all this means for downstream outcomes. Chris, you've written a bunch on how different kinds of elections, depending upon how they're structured, can yield a set of interests and outcomes that deviate significantly from, or can privilege a set of interests that deviate significantly from what you might think of as being like the modal or the median voter. So Vlad is suggesting, well, we shouldn't be thinking about the median voter, we should be thinking about kids in particular. And Domingo, you've been emphasizing the importance of, no, it's about communities as a whole and community involvement. Can you say a little bit about, Chris, the work that you've done in how elections are structured and the implications that they have for how we can drift pretty far away from whatever that median or core constituency that we have in mind?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I think this brings us back to a point Jessica made earlier, which is that there is always going to be disagreement about whose interests the school board should be prioritizing. And so, a canonical idea from political science is of the median voters, the median voter in the whole electorate, right? And but other people might suggest some particular community, some particular age group, parents, teachers, kids. So, but let's put that aside. But I think it's all going to come back to the fact that reasonable people might have different opinions about what the school board, or whether appointed or elected, should be doing. But I think, one concern about this question of taking an office and making it an independently elected position is to think beyond just the one in question, the school board, to think of the totality of the task that we're giving to voters. That is, how many different elected officials are they supposed to keep track of? And if you want to think about Cook County as an example, by my reckoning, the average person is already represented by something like 70 different elected officials, right? If you wanted to take the city, the county, the state, and the federal government, obviously every little local jurisdiction that we have, all the judge, I don't even have to mention judges to anyone in Cook County, and I to see their blood boil, right? Already I ask people, do you feel like you go into the voting booth and you have good information about all the people you're voting on? Do you really think you've been able to track all these elections? And so the question is, in that world where voters really have a hard time already keeping track of all the people they get to elect, what is the impact of adding a new one, whether that would be a school board or something else? And an idea that's already come up in a couple of places is that the people who care most about the outcomes are going to be the ones who are going to track most closely that particular election. And whether that's going to be a school board or a park district or something else, it'll be the same result. And one concern I have is that when you begin to multiply those choices and you have a bunch of separately elected governments, each that's just concerned about one thing, and each that's beholden to one particular interest group, which is the one little group of people who cared about that thing, you don't really have anybody who's accountable for the bottom line. And what is really a big concern in Chicago now is, obviously our fiscal situation, maybe the worst in the country, and who is ultimately accountable for that bottom line. And the more we create and proliferate independent little jurisdictions that each do one thing, the less and less possible it is for voters to A, keep track of them, B, hold them accountable. And so I think this is a concern that goes beyond just the choice about this one school board, but seeing it in the totality of the institutions we've put together here, which a theme that's come up throughout this panel is sometimes you can have too much democracy, or elections can lead to outcomes that are less representative than some alternative.
And you didn't give a shout out to your book, so I want to. You wrote this fantastic book called Imperfect Union, which plays off a number of these themes that interested people ought to follow up and check out.
Thank you.
If we could, we're reaching at the top of the hour, and if I could go around once, and if you could briefly, dear panelists, there's this big debate going on, elected versus school boards. For people who are concerned and interested, what is one thing you would have them really pay attention to? There's lots in play. What's a thing that you want to elevate? Say, don't lose sight of this as you try to make sense of what the optimal system is. Now, I can see you're all are sort of thinking, all right, how do I do that? Don't pick me first. I'm going to pick Rebecca. You go first, and just say what's one thing you want to make sure people keep their attention trained on.
I think regardless of whether or not it is elected or appointed, I would put a plug for local, like Jessica said, local news that's really going to cover these meetings and make them open meetings, regardless of appointed or elected, and that there really is a way for community organizations to be able to get access to what's going on so that they can share that information out with people.
Great, great. Domingo.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think we just need to think about ways to increase participation, particularly among the most marginalized. And so that means that we think about ways, like has been said already, timing. How is it that we're increasing the likelihood that they'll participate through voter registration and all these kinds of things? So increasing the likelihood that those most affected by these policies will participate, I think that's important.
Okay, we got local news, we got participation rates. Jessica.
I would say in designing the system, something that's really important to pay attention to is how people get access to the system or to their officials if something is going wrong, if they don't like what's happening. So that might be democracy, that might be not.
Terrific, and that's going to be important. It's going to spill into our conversation tomorrow when we're thinking about issues involving accountability. Chris.
Well, I guess I would take this opportunity to recall one of the great 20th century political scientists, William Riker, who said that when people understand politics and disagree about policy, their disagreements will take the form of disagreements about institutions. When people understand politics and disagree about policy, their disagreements will become disagreements about institutions. And so what I would urge people to think of is that what's at stake here, this isn't really about whether we have an elected school board or an appointed school board. It's about whose influences are going to be dominant. And if for the voter out there, I mean, I can't tell you which side you should come down on, but I can say, look who's behind each of these proposals and decide which of those interests look like the one you support. The biggest interest behind the elected school board is the Chicago Teachers Union. Okay, there's a whole set of other institutions behind preserving the current status quo, and this more you would see from the corporate community and the good governance community and the sort of status quo democratic community. So look to whose interests are behind this and understand that this disagreement is really not about institutions. It's about whose influences are going to predominate, and choose your vote accordingly.
Process is policy. Thank you, Chris. Vlad, we started with you. We're going to end with you. What's the one thing you want people to not to lose sight of?
I think the importance of information, and so the media is part of that, but part of that is also statistics and data and accountability systems, right? So I think a key thing for making education governance work, whether it's elected or appointed, is providing constituents with really high quality information about student outcomes in a way that allows them to really isolate, the contribution that the schools and teachers and principals are making. And I think that's one of the political battles that's happening now nationally, and I think that is going to be really consequential for thinking about how these governance models work out in the long run.
Vlad, Rebecca, Jessica, Chris, Domingo, thank you all for spending an hour. This was a terrific conversation. We're going to gather again, all of us together, and we hope all of you, dear listeners, will come join us tomorrow again at noon. The link has been posted to talk about what these issues of representation mean and engagement mean for systems of democratic accountability and ultimately for a set of educational outcomes that we all care about. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.